I'm Sam Von Trapp here at the Trapp Family Lodge. Today is March 31st, I believe, and obviously much of our country is on lockdown. We had wanted to give people some entertainment in their homes. Our cattle here, our herd of Scotch Highland cattle, are very popular with our guests to visit, and we've gotten questions from quite a few of you, and the questions are good, so I'm going to go ahead and dive into them. So first question was, how long has the Trapp Family Lodge had cows, and why and how did Scottish Highland cattle end up here? So basically, we had, when my family bought the farm in 1942 here, they started to operate basic farming, so they had dairy cattle starting in 1943. My father thinks that went through about 1948. And then the year my dad, Johannes, graduated college, 1963, he got the herd of Scotch Highland cattle. They're beautiful animals. They're very rugged. They do very well in this climate. We actually had a question about that as well, as far as why do we have Scotch Highland cattle. Similar climate here as far as some cold, some rain, some snow. So these animals that can handle life in the mountains of Scotland also do pretty well here in Vermont. They also tend to be pretty low maintenance. They're not a tremendously large-bodied animal. Often the bigger animals have more health challenges, and these are durable little smaller cattle. We got them, as I said, in 1963. We got the herd of Highlanders. We've got one over here that's, he's not threatening our cameraman, but he is not respecting the social distancing with our camera. Got them in 1963, and then there was a period there in the 80s and 90s where we didn't have the cattle here again, but then we brought them back in 1994, and we've had this herd ever since then. And by the way, the source of these cattle was right here in Vermont. There were people breeding Scotch Highland cows. We're not the only ones who think that these animals are good for Vermont. Alice Smith asked us the question, how long do they live? And by the way, I didn't know all the answers to all these questions, so I did have to talk to my father, Johannes. And my father was informing me today that some of these cows, some of these Highlanders, can actually continue to produce calves into their late teens. That's a long time for an animal like this. A lot of this relates to what they are eating. The lifespan of cattle is based upon their teeth. And eventually, all of this grinding up of so much vegetation eventually takes a toll on their teeth. When their teeth wear out, that is basically the end of their lifetime. And that's not uncommon with other animals as well. Elephants do the same thing, except they get multiple sets of teeth before they wear out. So some of these animals in this pasture could be into their teenage years already. What do the cows eat? We bring them, as you can see, we bring them hay in the wintertime. We also feed them the spent grain from the brewery here. The spent grain has the starches removed from it, so it doesn't have the negative health impact on the animals that feeding regular whole grain would have. So that's a nice supplement to add to them here. And as you can imagine, we're feeding them this hay, we're feeding them this spent grain. They are quickly converting it to manure. And as spring comes in more and more, and the insects, the bacteria in the soil start to be more active, they're going to break this manure down quite quickly, and it'll be assimilating into the soils again. In the fall, when we're making our apple cider right here on the property, we're feeding the leftovers, the smashed apple, to them. Many apple trees in this pasture, they're eating those apples in the fall. But the great thing is, basically from around the middle of May through early November, they are just eating lush green grass, clover. They've got a ton to eat from here. We have 7 different pastures that we move them throughout. We do follow an intensive rotational grazing program here. So we put them in a pasture. They're there for an intensive period of time. Ideally, they're going to eat it all down, and then you move them to another pasture, and that lets the other pasture, the first pasture, completely regenerate without the pressure of the animals. One of the worst things that you can do as far as grazing practices and taking good care of your land is to leave the animals in the same field continuously. And occasionally you'll see that. You drive past a farm, you look out, you'll see there's a couple of cows in a field, and you'll see the weeds are doing really well. The weeds are right up there, but the things that the cattle like to eat are grazed all the way back down to the ground. So this rotational grazing really helps. It's good for the cattle, and it's better for the land. How long does their hair grow, and how come some have longer hair than others? Do we ever trim their hair? That question comes from Jen DeVos. We do not trim their hair, other than very occasionally if we're trying to mark a cow, we might go in and snip the hair at the end of her tail just by bobbing the tail. That helps us to identify that cow. Say it's a cow that we want to check on for something health-wise, or it's a cow that we've identified that we should ship out the next time. So other than bobbing the tails, we do not mess with their hair at all. Some of them are shaggier. The Highlanders are going to be shaggier than the ones that have some Red Devon blend. We brought in about maybe 7 or 8 years ago, we brought in a Red Devon bull. We used the Devon bulls for that entire period up until last year. So there is some mixed blood in here as well. We went back to a Highland bull last year, so we'll start seeing more of those typical Highland traits in the herd here in the future. And we do have a question on here as well about are there any babies on the way? And the answer is we hope so. We had no calves born last year because we had a problem with that bull. That's why we brought in the new Highland bull. So we very much hope to have about 20 calves plus or minus this year, which is what we typically get on a regular productive year. We also have a question about how many of them do we use in our restaurants. That also came from Julie Higgins. And this year our plan is to harvest about 15 to 20 head. We'll see what happens. We had just sent out 5 head about a week before all of our restaurants closed for dine-in service. So obviously things are a little bit dynamic this year, and I can imagine that we might be harvesting fewer animals. It's always good for me to take a look behind myself every now and then, make sure no one's sneaking up on me. These animals generally are very gentle with us. We do work them on foot. However, if they start to play around with each other, maybe push each other around a little bit, that's when I really like to be careful, because they might bump into me accidentally. Generally speaking, our current 6-foot social distancing is generally, for me, a distance at which I feel fairly safe. We do, of course, encourage our guests not to enter our pastures if there are cattle in there already. That's kind of obvious. Speaking of that word, cattle, cattle versus cows, one of the questions we had was, are all the cows female? And I can guarantee you, without a doubt, that absolutely all of our cows are female, because cow is the word for a female bovine. So when we're talking about them as a group, including the males, then we refer to them as cattle. So we have out here, we have cows, we have heifers, which is young cows, we've got our bull, and then we also have steers. The steers were born as bulls and then were castrated, and those are primarily what we're using in the restaurant. So here I am with our bull. He does not have a name. He's only been with us for about a year, and eventually his personality will produce a name organically for him. One of the questions that I hadn't gotten to yet was how big are the calves when they are born, and do they have hair? That came from Aurora Jane. They typically are in the high 50s to 60s pounds. Relatively small weight animals for calving, which is a good thing. That makes for fewer complications. That's another reason why my father liked Highlanders as a breed for us, because it's really nice if you don't have complications during calving season. Another question from Dorothy Madison Drobny. Does their hair change color as they age? We don't think so, but it certainly can change a little bit with the sun. You know, their hair is gonna bleach a tiny bit, the same way ours does. But generally speaking, no, we don't see a graying from them with age like we do with us. Question of how much do they weigh? 1,100 pounds would be a big one. Typically they're in that sort of 900 to 1,000 pound range. Again, Highland cows are a relatively small breed, which means that they're not going to be producing as much meat, but they're also a little bit lower maintenance as well. What's up, buddy? You can see that on our bull here, if I walk this way, he'll probably look more at me. You can see that his horn, his left-hand horn, really droops down. Typically speaking, Bob, if you can pan to the cow over here, so if you look at that cow, her horns really go up. And then with this bull, his horn, he's got one horn going out, one going down. That's a characteristic which is pretty consistent. The females tend to have the horns going up and the males more out or down. This one over here, this dark one that just walked up behind our bull, she is the daughter of Emily, who we got from Chris Poacher. Many of you know Chris Poacher, who leads tours here with us. He was getting out of the cattle business and asked if we would buy Emily because he was fond of her. He and his wife were fond of her. So Emily produced an amazing calf every year, and some of her heifers have already gone on to produce their own calves. So it's nice to see her bloodline continuing here as well. It's pretty easy to recognize her calves because they have this darker color, so they really stand out. So now we've got one of our lovely old mamas in the background. You can see those wonderful horns. The horns, they do have blood flow inside the horns, so it is active. Horns are basically made of the same material as our hair, our fingernails. Horns, unlike antlers, the horns stay on the animal ideally for its entire life. Antlers are shed by the animal every year and have to be regrown. And in the case of, occasionally you'll see an animal where the horn broke. That will sometimes happen if they're fighting with each other, if they catch it against a tree. So occasionally a horn will break and they're fine. It just sort of seals itself off and they're perfectly fine. There was a question on how many cows we have here, or how many head of cattle we have here. We've got about 50 in our herd in total, and again, we hope that number will go up above 70 with a strong calving season this year. I like to think that this lady here is getting ready to produce a nice calf soon, and we'll be keeping an eye on them every day. Our guys are out here with them. Our crew is out here with the animals every single day. I drive past this pasture every day coming to and from. As you can imagine, agriculture is considered a necessary industry to continue staying active, and as you can tell, there's plenty of room for social distancing out here, so our guys are able to continue feeding them and taking care of them without any dangerous contact with other people at this moment. And let's see, what else? What a gorgeous day. And we hope that, that this virtual tour can provide a little bit of entertainment for those of you who are cooped up right now. Hang in there, stay positive. This too shall pass. And it's nice to see people taking action and banding together right now. These are obviously difficult days. And continue to send us your questions. If there's anything that we can do to help to entertain you while you're sheltering in place, we will do our best. Be well.